Good afternoon. On behalf of the Indiana University College of Arts and Sciences, I would like to thank you for joining us today. I'm Vanessa Clow, and I serve as the college's Director of Alumni Relations. As part of the college's special programming for our Celebrating Alumni Contributions, 200 plus years of impact initiative, our Food for Thought live streaming series serves as an opportunity for our alumni and friends to hear from faculty experts, explore topics of interest, and stay connected with IU and the College of Arts and Sciences during this time when we are unable to easily connect in person. I'm delighted to introduce today's featured presenters who will discuss the US's multidimensional histories of ongoing racist violence, injustice, and economic disparities. Our first speaker is Professor Michelle Moyd from the Department of History and the Center for Research on Race and Ethnicity in Society. Professor Moyd's research examines the history of East Africa, and especially its histories of warfare, violence, and soldiering during the German colonial period. She also teaches African history and the global history of World War I. Our next presenter is Professor Amrita Myers from the Department of Gender Studies and the Department of History. Professor Myers specializes in Black women's history in the Slave South. A committed activist, she frequently speaks on issues of racial justice and has published editorials and articles on anti-Blackness and policing. Our final presenter is Dr. Maisha Wester from the Department of American Studies. Professor Wester's research examines racial representation in horror films and appropriations of Gothic literary tropes in racial discourse. She is also joining us today from the United Kingdom, as she is currently on leave as a British Academy Global Professor at the University of Sheffield. Following their presentations, our speakers will be joined by the college's Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion, Vivian Holleran, for the audience Q&A session. Dr. Halloran is a professor of English, and her research examines Caribbean literature, food studies, and postmodernism. You can submit your questions at any point during today's discussion. Simply click on the Q&A tab located in your webinar toolbar. I also would like to mention that today's broadcast is also being closed captioned. Simply click on the CC link in your webinar toolbar as well. Hover your mouse over the screen and your toolbar should appear. Finally, the college wishes to acknowledge and honor the Miami, Delaware, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, and Shawnee people on whose ancestral homelands and resources Indiana University was built. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Professor Michelle Moyd.
Thank you, Vanessa, for inviting us to do this today. And thanks to Dr. Vivian Holleran for moderating. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. When we were first invited to participate in this series months ago, we had no idea we'd be doing so in the midst of a week like this one. We had all spent much of last summer doing our parts in various ways to help wider audiences understand the police murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, the murder of Ahmaud Arbery by men who thought of themselves as police auxiliaries, and so many other Black folks over the decades. We wanted to show these murders not as anomalies within a just society, but instead as all too common examples of a profoundly unjust, racist, and violent society. These murders and the protests that generated unprecedented levels of participation across the country were made all the more momentous because of the COVID-19 pandemic's rampage through our society and almost incomprehensible backdrop of suffering, grief, and death to the nationwide protests calling for social justice and reckoning with US racism. What we saw last week has a history. What we saw last week was a manifestation of deeply rooted and multi-layered cultures of violence. These cultures of violence include wars, massacres, and forced removals of indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands. They include the violent processes of enslaving millions of Africans who were transported across the Atlantic to perform the brutal labor that undergirded US wealth and power. As you'll hear from my colleague, Dr. Amrita Chakrabarti Myers, the history of policing in this country is bound up with these histories. And as you'll hear from my colleague, Dr. Maisha Wester, the images and words our society consumes about Black people are rooted in and driven by these violent histories in ways that often go unnoticed. So ingrained are they in our everyday cultural lives. As humanities scholars trained in our disciplines, one of our primary professional responsibilities is to share our research perspectives on vexed, complex issues with our students so that they can practice thinking about the world in new, complex ways. We hope that they leave our classrooms with the tools to make the world a better place, to help them become critical thinkers and thoughtful interpreters of media, entertainment, and politics. Let me share some perspectives from my own work, and I'm hoping that you can all see this PowerPoint. So as you heard, I'm a historian of Eastern Africa. I study what is today Tanzania, but which between 1890 and 1918 was colonized by Germany and known as German East Africa. My particular focus is on soldiers recruited from disparate locations across the African continent who fought for the German colonial army. Led by German officers and NCOs, they carried out the military conquest and occupation of a vast territory several times larger than unified Germany. They were celebrated as loyal, dedicated soldiers who stuck by the Germans until the bitter end of the German colonial empire at the end of World War I. Yet these men were responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths of African peoples, the destruction of their homes, villages, lands, and livelihoods, the trampling of their religious and political practices. Why did they choose to participate in such violence? The main reason my research shows was that they wanted to secure respectable lives for themselves as men of means and influence. They wanted to wield authority over others, to have substantial households, to access upward mobility and rewards. They wanted to be men. The fact that they could never command or exercise authority over white Germans will likely not come as a surprise. But why? Shouldn't African soldiers who served have had the same opportunities to advance and wield the same authority as white soldiers? For African colonial armies, this question is almost too obvious, since with very few exceptions, European colonizers could never imagine the possibility of putting white men under the command of Black men. Yet the Black soldiers' images continued to infuse German popular culture well after the end of the German Empire, even though they were left to fend for themselves after 1918. Let's turn to the US and look at how this played out for the descendants of Africans whose forebears had been enslaved and who were living through the post-Reconstruction regime of violence known by the shorthand of Jim Crow. To be clear, Black soldiers have fought in this country's wars from its founding to the present, and they have done so for many reasons. But perhaps most importantly, they have done so in order to secure and demonstrate their status as citizens in a country that continually fails to view them as such. Today, I'll simply point to their service in the American Expeditionary Force, or AEF, during World War I. When they first arrived in France, they worked as manual laborers, stevedores, and such. When they finally took up combat roles on the Western Front, they did not fight alongside their fellow AEF soldiers. Rather, they were assigned to French units commanded by French officers. One unit, the 369th Infantry Regiment, nicknamed the Harlem Hellfighters, became one of the most decorated of the AEF, but the decorations came from France, not the US. Upon their return to the US in 1919, they were celebrated in a parade down Fifth Avenue of New York City. Yet they also returned to a US in which the Klan was resurgent, anti-immigrant and anti-communist agitation and action was heightened, leading to many deportations. It was a violent time in this country. Black veterans wearing uniforms were targets of racist violence, including lynchings. It's easy to be drawn to heroic stories of military service and valor in combat. In this country, it's one of the most consistent kinds of stories we tell. But this is too easy, and this is why it is important to think critically about what soldiers do under what conditions, and with what expectations, theirs and their societies. To tell the full story about Black soldiers' military service, we must also acknowledge some more difficult truths. In the case of the African men of the German colonial army, they were responsible for devastating death tolls and widespread destruction in German East Africa. And they fought in the name of German Empire, even if their priorities were more specific to their own circumstances. In the US, Black troops who fought in World War I helped the Entente defeat Germany, but still could not access full citizenship upon their return home to the US. I'll end with an image from last week's troubling events at the Capitol. Many of you by now will have seen the video footage of US Capitol Police Officer Eugene Goodman, a 10-year veteran, and before that, a US Army veteran, being pursued by a white mob inside the Capitol building, wielding nothing but a baton. We now know that he lured the mob away from legislators and their staffs, possibly saving lives. He is now being widely described as a hero, perhaps the only heroic figure to emerge from a day of unconscionable failures. How are we to interpret his elevation to the status of hero in light of the ways that Black police are used to counter Black people's testimonies about everyday racism and violence at the hands of police? In other words, how are Black police officers used differently in our media landscape to undermine Black people's experiences of racism, both everyday and structural? My point is not to detract from his bravery and sharpness in carrying out his duties. His actions were extraordinary on a day of shockingly substandard performances. Rather, I want to ask what his image and his heroic story means within a wider visual universe of that day at the Capitol, where the predominantly white male mob engaged in a wide range of violent and other criminal behaviors. What does it mean to be a Black police officer in a moment when the institution of policing has come under widespread and long overdue scrutiny, calls for more accountability and abolition? We will see over the next days and weeks what purposes, political and otherwise, Officer Goodman's image will serve. What I know from my research is that Officer Goodman's image, like images of other Black soldiers serving states and empires, will be used for purposes far beyond his control. One of the things I can do as a humanities scholar is offer multiple readings or interpretations of images to provide historical context for them and to encourage students to cultivate the curiosity and skills that will allow them to interpret such images more fully. And as you'll see from my colleagues' presentations, the humanities and liberal arts more broadly provide us and our students with the tools to do so. As we all continue to parse what happened last week, it is clear that the need for people with these skills, aptitudes, and sensibilities is urgent. The liberal arts is vital to producing the next generation of artists, thinkers, scientists, leaders, and professionals who can assert the need and do the work for more just futures. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Moyd, for those really wonderful opening words. And thank you so much for the college for inviting us to be here today. When we were invited, as Professor Moyd said several months ago, to put together this panel, we of course had no idea that we would be coming to you 1 week to the day after the events in our nation's capital last week. And so it puts us in a very different situation from the one that we imagined when we were talking about this last fall. My name is Amrita Myers, and as Vanessa mentioned, I am a historian. And so I come to you with a presentation titled today, What the History of Slavery Can Teach Us About Policing, Structural Racism, and the Way Forward. Last summer, anti-racism protesters demonstrated in cities across the nation in the wake of the death of George Floyd, decrying police brutality. Tensions escalated after the president sent US agents, mostly drawn from Border Patrol, to supposedly protect federal courthouses in places like Portland. The president's deployment of highly militarized troops with no training in crowd control inflamed the situation in that city, leading to clashes between protesters and troops who threw tear gas, flashbangs, and pepper balls into the crowd. The thing is, such behavior on the part of police isn't new. The death of Black people at the hands of the police isn't new. For centuries, Black people have been terrorized by those who wear the blue. Breonna Taylor, Dre'Jon Reed, George Floyd, and Rayshard Brooks were just the latest victims in a long line of Black people that police violence had consumed. That particular string of police killings led to renewed national calls to, quote, defund the police. The argument is simple. The current system isn't keeping Black people safe. Chicago community organizer Jessica Disu made this point 4 years ago when she told broadcaster Megyn Kelly, quote, "We need to abolish the police, period. Demilitarize the police, disarm the police, and we need to come up with community solutions for transformative justice," end quote. Her words cut to the heart of the issue, revealing a truth that historians like myself of the Old South have long known. American policing was never meant to keep Black people safe. It was designed to uphold white supremacy by surveilling, assaulting, capturing, and killing Black people. Policing in America traces its roots back to the institution of the Slave Patrol, which many of you may have heard. Formed in South Carolina in 1704, white men in every county had to give 1 night of service to their local patrol each month. Some colonies ordered their local militias to select patrollers from all the white men in the region within a certain age range. In other areas, only landowners served on these particular patrols. Regardless of how patrollers were chosen, however, their job was the same: to ride the roadways at night, often accompanied by hunting dogs, to monitor enslaved people. White people feared seeing Black people out at night. They believed Black folks were either conspiring to rebel, committing property crimes like arson or theft, or fleeing from bondage. Accordingly, any Black person found out after dark was stopped by the patrol, frisked for weapons, and made to show their freedom papers or a pass from their owner, which is highly reminiscent of today's stop and frisk policies, I might add. If they tried to run, they were hunted down. No papers, that person was taken to the local jail to await for their master to come and claim them, usually after being beaten up. Or they had to await sale on the auction block if no white person vouched for their freedom. Many free Blacks even found themselves kidnapped by the patrol and sold into slavery. This is exactly what happened to Solomon Northup, author of 12 Years a Slave, which was recently made into a motion picture. This isn't just a Southern story. Every one of the original 13 colonies had legalized slavery, and colonies like Connecticut and New York passed numerous laws to criminalize and control their local Black populations, including prohibiting the use of alcohol and guns. Urbanization in the 19th century made this kind of volunteer part-time patrol system difficult to maintain as communities grew larger. The first publicly funded organized police force with full-time officers was created in Boston in 1838. Boston was a large commercial center, and businesses had been hiring private security to protect their property. Merchants, however, realized that it was cheaper to transfer the cost of maintaining a police force onto the city's citizens, arguing that it was for the collective good. Cities across the North and the South then began establishing police forces, although it was haphazard and departments were not uniform in size or scope. After the Civil War, local governments in the South began giving police forces many of the jobs that slave patrols had once carried out. And quote unquote new laws known as the Black Codes began empowering these police forces to surveil Black communities, enforce curfews, and arrest Black people for owning or carrying guns or drinking, similar to laws that we've already seen. Although African Americans tried to join these new police forces, most departments maintained white-only policies or made life so dangerous for new Black cadets that they left policing altogether. These all-white police forces were essentially enforcing the regulations from slavery. The Black Codes simply transferred the powers of surveillance from slaveholders to the state, and the police now became the arm of the state, used to control a population that white people had always feared. Trained to be anti-Black agents of violence, the police now protected white people and white property, real and movable. The behavior of Southern whites in the post-war era revealed that the passage of the 13th Amendment hadn't changed how they saw Black people, either as property or a threat to their property and power. This is exemplified by how many members of the legal system, from police officers to judges, joined the Ku Klux Klan or the Regulators or other white supremacist organizations when they were created after the Civil War. White people refer to the violence engaged in by the Klan as extra legal. Lynch mobs, however, were able to break Black people out of custody and murder them in broad daylight because members of law enforcement enabled it. Indeed, they were often part of the mob. The connections between Reconstruction and what happened at the Capitol on January the 6th, 2021 are thus clear. We know now that off-duty police officers from all over the country traveled to Washington to join the attempted coup last week. While individual Black officers are already being held up for the performed acts of heroism, or were targeted by the mob actually for violence last week, the insurrectionists could not have breached the Capitol building itself without the cooperation of the Capitol Police. While law enforcement worked to prevent women's rights and BLM demonstrators from getting anywhere near the Capitol in January 2017 and the summer of 2020 respectively, they permitted entrance to the insurrectionists last week. We must thus ask ourselves why we continue to see policing as a mechanism of protection. Who and what are they meant to protect? While the physical presence of Union troops in the South during Reconstruction slowed this kind of behavior by the police, after 1877, when the troops were removed, Southern sheriffs and officers went back to functioning in ways that were analogous to the earlier slave patrols. Only now they also enforce segregation and the disenfranchisement of Black people. The relationship between Black communities and the police only worsened as Black neighborhoods continued to be over-policed well into the 20th century. White audiences were shocked by the sheer brutality of police forces when they witnessed coverage of the 1960s civil rights demonstrations from places like Birmingham. Then new television technology brought the water hoses, attack dogs, and billy clubs of Eugene Bull Connor's police forces directly into living rooms all across America during the dinner hour, first in Black and white and then in full color. The practices of Bull's boys made it perfectly clear that while a century had passed since the end of slavery, the ideologies of the slave patrol right down to the hunting dogs were alive and well. While the violence against peaceful protesters may have helped to pass civil rights legislation, it didn't lead to reforms in US policing. In fact, it had the opposite effect. The rise of the Black Panther Party for self-defense and a new generation's calls for Black power, which told Black people to arm themselves and defend their communities against police brutality, made law enforcement even more deadly. As targets of intense FBI surveillance, many of the Panther leadership found themselves shot dead by various law enforcement agencies, imprisoned or on the run. Left in cities devastated by the uprisings of the late 60s, with poor schools and few job prospects, abandoned by their local governments except for a large police presence, the war on drugs began ravaging the Black community in the 1980s. Drug use and drug addiction were criminalized instead of being handled as an illness or a public health crisis. That's when money really poured into policing. The numbers of officers in Black communities and schools increased exponentially, and police departments began acquiring military-grade gear. Through it all, the ideas that animated the original slave patrols, a fear of Black people, and the desire to watch and control them persisted. So too did the tactics of violence that began in South Carolina in 1704. The study of history helps us to understand that present-day calls to defund the police are calls to dismantle the larger systems of white supremacy in the United States. It is a system that sees Black people as inherently dangerous and needing to be surveilled, controlled, and killed, because that is the way it was designed. The solution to this problem will be multifaceted, but the way forward must be based on an understanding that the system of policing in America is both historically and structurally racist. To do something to fix it will require that we create a system that doesn't perpetuate assumptions and practices rooted in the slave patrol. This is already happening. On June 5th, 2020, the mayor of Los Angeles announced he was diverting $150 million from the police budget and reallocating it to youth jobs, health initiatives, and healing the community. 4 days later, on June 9th, the Minneapolis City Council voted to defund and dismantle their police department altogether, similar to actions that were taken in Camden, New Jersey in 2014. Minneapolis City Council President Lisa Bender stated, quote, "Our efforts at incremental reform have failed." We can take assault weapons away from the police. We can drain their pension plans when they break the law. We can build in community oversight. But ultimately, we must divert funds away from a system of violence and towards mediation, drug treatment, mental health, social workers, methods of restorative justice instead of punitive justice, and more. We must decriminalize marijuana and sex work, which will decrease the numbers of police officers required on our streets and release numerous nonviolent persons from our prison system. We need new ideas that aren't based on old systems, because as we've seen, the historic system of policing is inherently racist and it's killing us. Where we go from here is up to us. We have an opportunity to create something better, to do better, and to be better. The time to dismantle the slave patrol is long overdue. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Moyd and Dr. Myers, for those important histories which are so little discussed. Today, I want to think about what's at stake in popular representations, particularly those which are often deemed non-political. I would like to start with an excerpt from, give me 1 second, Michael Bernard Logan's book, Fears of Your Life. People are fearful of me, which I wonder is they think I'm all that terrible, or I'm thinking that they think I'm not human at all, because when they sit next to me, then they get back up and move away from me. I may be a stranger, but that doesn't make me a created monster or something like that. They don't think who's feeling they hurt at all. They just do it. No consideration whatsoever. People don't think about how they hurt my feelings and don't give a hoot. They don't give a crap. Published in 2012, police assaults hadn't escalated to the fever pitch of our current moment, though we had, however, already had Trayvon Martin, who was killed in part because he seemed a monster in a hoodie. Bell Hooks and James Baldwin noted that as Black filmgoers in America, you are taught to take pleasure in the assaults upon and destruction of your own body. And this is true for minorities, even beyond African Americans, given that Baldwin notes that this pleasure is also conveyed in games like Cowboys and Indians, which is a spoof of early films like early Westerners. Now, I want to think in particular about the representations at play in the horror film genre, because again, quite often when we talk about horror films, we assume that there are no politics within them, unless we're talking about, of course, Jordan Peele recently. But for instance, if we were to look back to King Kong in the 1930s, what we see is a thinly veiled anti-miscegenation narrative. If we were to look around the same era at films such as White Zombie and I Walked with a Zombie, we see that the Black rapist narrative is even more explicit. Later films such as Leprechaun, I have a clip here from Leprechaun in the Hood in particular, stresses Blacks as self-destructive and vengeful figures. And even when Blacks are actually the victims of violence in horror films, in films such as Candyman, Skeleton Key, and Bag of Bones, somehow they nonetheless become the primary monster of these films. Their rage rendering them so inhuman that their white assault, which produced the rage, is a second to their monstrosity. Now, I could go on at length about such films, but I would direct you to CRRES's Confronting Racism series, which is now available as recordings on Facebook for more detail. But I want to think about how, being taught to take pleasure in the suffering of minorities on film is true in a different way for white Americans, who are taught also to take pleasure in spectacles of anti-minority and xenophobic violence. For them, at least, the violence is not to their own body. Now, you might want to argue, hey, we watch white on white violence all the time, but look at these films more closely. What we see quite often are that the violated and violating white bodies in such films are quite often either ethnically othered, often Irish or Italian gangsters, or they're economically othered and thus not quite white. Now today, Logan's concerns would be more than hurt feelings. Indeed, George Floyd, Michael Brown, and Eric Garner were all described as hulking, Frankenstein-like creatures. Samira Rice, the mother of Tamir Rice, recalls that in reaching her son before he passed, she was denied the opportunity to ride along with him in the ambulance because the police and the EMT workers considered her son evidence, not human. A similar understanding is behind the lack of prosecution for the officers who shot Tamir Rice, Breonna Taylor, Jacob Black, among numerous others. Now, I should note that in Breonna Taylor's case, Brett Hankinson, one of the officers involved, was charged, but not with murder, not even with manslaughter. Rather, he was charged with wanton endangerment. Now, I have to note that in looking for images for this slide, I was confronted with a plethora of Black victims, names of whom many of us have not heard or know about because they were not at a time, did not occur at a time when the media was on them, was watching. But we should also consider how would-be victims, and I have a number of these would-be victims listed below, are also victims of this failure to see Blacks as fully human and equal citizens. Would-be victims like LaShondra Evans, who found herself subject of when the police stormed into her dorm room with guns drawn in the middle of the night after her roommate and several friends filed a false report saying that LaShondra was trying to stab them with scissors. Again, we must wonder at the police response there. Indeed, as Dr. Myers and Dr. Moyd have already pointed out, we can also see the difference in how Blacks in particular are understood and misrecognized in terms of the police response to the siege on the Capitol versus their responses to the many Black Lives Matter protests. Indeed, these responses and the difference in these responses reveal that people of color are clearly not seen as fully human. Even our allies are deemed worthy of assault because they betray their white privilege in standing by us. And if you want to really consider the obscenity of police response to Black Lives Matter, I would invite you to consider the extent to which even PETA protesters receive better treatment. Now, this problem of misrepresentation extends beyond the question of anti-Black police violence. We might, for instance, think of Dr. Susan Moore, pictured at the top in the center, the Indianapolis doctor who died of COVID after failing to receive adequate treatment. IU Health's Dennis Murphy claimed that Moore likely intimidated nursing staff by, quote, using social media to voice her concerns and critique the care that they were delivering, end quote. Now, I must say, as someone who deals with public people, I find this response problematic. No matter what my students or what my audience may be tweeting about me, I'm still going to attend to them. I'm still going to do my job. Moore, indeed, was merely advocating for her right to receive proper treatment. But sadly, her case is not at all uncommon, as many Black people and Black women in particular are presumed to have higher pain thresholds, but are also perceived to be addicts and criminals, and thus undeserving of equal treatment. Indeed, assaults on African Americans are in a way now a fashion trend. And an example of this is called swatting. And this is in LaShondra Evans' story is an example of this. Swatting is when a false claim is filed against a person with the aim of getting the police squad to raid the person's location. Now, in the liberal arts and humanities and in centers like CRRES, we strive to counter these destructive narratives and representations. We hope to teach people to see how we are all subtly instructed from our earliest moments as media and literary consumers to view minorities not just as other, but as less than human. We teach people to challenge and critique such subtle expression, and more so, to create different kinds of expressions. Our goal is not to stop people from enjoying media and films, but to be critical of it and demand more from it. We strive to teach others to demand we tell a different story and thus hopefully start telling a different narrative, to help people to actually see each other. We strive to teach our students to not only see each other, but in seeing, to also defend each other and thus demand more for each other. This completes our presentation. We'll be happy to accept any questions you might have.
Hi. Right now, please go ahead and use the Q&A button to share your questions with us. But in the meanwhile, I want to thank Dr. Wester, Dr. Myers, and Dr. Moyd for their thought-provoking presentations. And I wanted to pose the first question because I see that the thread of people usurping the police function is present in all three of your presentations, as well as the call for action to have either faculty in their classrooms or students who have benefited from the wisdom of their classes in these topics to use those critical functions that they've developed in classes and think creatively in Dr. Myers's case, to come up with alternatives and solutions to the problems of systemic racism and anti-Black violence embedded within the systems that you've all discussed. So I wondered if you wanted to speak about this notion of the usurpation of the police function as a separate or related after effect of the problematic nature of policing in the United States and or of military service. As Professor Moyd mentioned, there are policemen who are former military as well. And that's open to all three of you.
Vivian, I'm sorry, would you mind clarifying what you mean by usurpation of a police function? I'm not sure I'm following that.
Certainly. I was thinking when people are acting, as in Trayvon Martin's case, for example, when the attacker decided to act as if he had the authority and the police power to determine where Trayvon could be. Also, I'm thinking in terms of the recent insurrection in Washington, D.C., where people took it upon themselves to go right a wrong they objected to by going against the police, taking physical action against the police, and thinking it was their duty to protect what they thought was being attacked, right? And in Professor Myers' presentation, she talked about the origins of the police in South Carolina as volunteering and having to do these patrols at night, but also people with with cameras following Black people who live, right, in the park, at the mall, in various different things, and reporting people for doing everyday activities, that usurpation of power that results from white privilege.
Thank you. Yeah. So I'll just say one thing, which you may have heard me use the word police auxiliaries in describing the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. The men who killed him were not police, but they were men who essentially deputized themselves because they had heard about some sort of attempted break-in, and they saw Mr. Arbery, and they chased him and they murdered him. While using derogatory language, to name him in that moment. So, that is one clear example I can see from our recent history, where one of the features of American society is that it is deeply militarized and deeply surveilled, constantly surveilled, in ways that most of us have barely begun to reckon with, I think. And so if you're a Black person in this country, and this is why I think it's hard for many white folks to even sort of grasp what we're talking about, what it feels like to go out into a world where you know that you are constantly under surveillance, and that the police are more likely to see you as some kind of undesirable rather than, somebody with citizenship, or even if not a citizen, like somebody who is a human, right? That's constant. And so that infuses the way that we see the world, right? Regardless of our privilege, regardless of what status we have in society, if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong cop, that might be it. So that's one way. And then I'll just say one other thing, which is the sort of vexed position that somebody like Officer Goodman is in, right? In this moment, what's so interesting about it is that he is simultaneously supposed to be the authority, the militarized authority that is protecting the heart of our government, right? From a white mob, which views him as a Black man wielding authority over them. And I think that analysis is going to be, whenever somebody takes it on and does it in its fullness, is going to be really important for a number of things, not least the ways that Black police are often brought up in a sort of a very irresponsible and flip way to say, well, the police can't be racist because they're a Black police officer. There's just no substance there. And I hope that what we've talked about today will sort of highlight some of that moving forward.
Yeah, I'll also say, in thinking about citizens in particular usurping the power of law enforcement or taking on those powers, I have to think back to, what was originally a comedic notion, but also one that very much had carried weight, which was the notion of citizens arrest, right? this notion that any upstanding citizen has the right to intercede in a crime. Now, if we couple that with, for instance, the massive rates of gun ownership and the idea behind gun ownership in America in particular, which is, the right to protect now, not just yourself and your home, but also your community, right? We have therein a sense of policing connected to the ownership of massive weaponry. And then when we coordinate that alongside the kind of racial messaging and representations we often get, we then understand that citizens are being taught to police against a very particular segment of the population, to follow very particular bodies, and that it's their duty and their right to do so. And the end is, is beyond words, is beyond pain in terms of thinking of the chaos, animosity, and destruction it's wrought.
I really appreciate the question, Dr. Halloran, because I think it really does go back to the history that I tried to lay out. Because from the institution of the patrols, right, every single, white man in the area was deputized to ride the patrols at night. And they were given this charge, and the charge was, right, to surveil Black people, and that Black people were, as I said, property or a threat to white people's property. And that foundation has never really, it laid a really insidious groundwork for this nation. You can't come out of the Civil War and expect white people to flip a switch and for police officers to flip a switch and all of a sudden look at Black people and say, oh, well, they're no longer property or a threat to property. They're now citizens in need of protection. Just because you pass a 13th Amendment doesn't mean that white people writ large and police officers in particular are going to all of a sudden make that mental switch. They actually never did make that mental switch. They had been conditioned even before the passage of the slave patrol, before the slave patrols came to fruition, right? From the moment we came here, right, we writ large came here and began taking indigenous people's land and setting up capitalist enterprises with stolen labor, right? There was an understanding that, that Black people were a threat and that they had to be policed and contained because, of course, they didn't want to be here. So it's that impossible shift. All of a sudden, you're expecting white people to see Black people as citizens, and you're expecting police to see them as citizens in need of protection instead of property or a threat to property. That shift simply was never made. And the problem also is that the motto to protect and serve, well, to protect and serve whom? From what? And the thing is, it's very simple. I mean, when law enforcement is called out, during BLM demonstrations, it's to protect businesses and property, right? It's not to protect the protesters. And yet last week, when the mayor of DC asked for National Guardsmen to come out to protect the Capitol, that request was denied several times. Why? Because the mayor was told it wouldn't look good. Why wouldn't it look good? Well, it wouldn't look good to have National Guardsmen lined up against Trump protesters, against white people. It's perfectly okay to have National Guardsmen lining the buildings of DC against women's rights activists in January of 2017 and Black and brown protesters, really ethnically mixed protesters who are there protesting, right, travesties being performed against Black people in the summer of 2020, but it's not appropriate to have them lined up against the president, and all of the things that are happening right now in this political moment, because these are mainly white people who are protesting the quota, this to stop the steal and all of these other really egregious things that were said. And so I just think that your question is really important. And again, these are the sorts of things that we ask our students to unpack and critically analyze. and to perform really thoughtful, analytical, right, dialogue around, this is what the liberal arts asks people to do, is to go back, to perform analysis, to write these things through, but to then also problem solve individually and as teams. This is the kind of work that not just historians do, but sociologists and, you know, people from across the liberal arts and the humanities. It's just, but that's why I was hoping that, you know, we go beyond simply just performing analysis, but to also problem solve as well.
Well, along those lines, we have a question from the audience. Given the national security threat posed by white nationalist organizations in our country, what sort of measures do you see as necessary into the future to bring about stability, trust, and investment into our institutions? What role can researchers and public intellectuals such as yourselves play in this process? And a related question, how should we expect the various branches of the military to address the reality that many current white supremacist leaders and members are former military? So those two related questions.
Well, I can start and do a short answer to both. And this actually kind of relates to what we were just talking about regarding the usurpation of police functions. And what I want to say here is that, you know, one of the things that I think is really difficult for many Americans to grapple with right now is the recognition, what was made very clear in what happened last Wednesday, is that there's a significant portion of the population that feels entitled to enter that space and then symbolically to exert a certain kind of power. And that power is white power. And if we cannot come to a place where we can name what happened last week as that, we're in trouble for a really long time. So what became clear is that democracy is not a shared value, right? It is not a shared value, or at least there are different definitions of what democracy might be. And so that's the kind of work that every single university professor in this country should be undertaking in some kind of way right now. As to, you know, what we expect the military to do, I mean, I think we've seen the first step where the command structure has said, you know, we will obey lawful orders. We serve the Constitution, we do not serve an individual. That kind of language has been made clear, right? And in the strongest terms that I can remember in my life. So clearly the military leadership is signaling something. But the work of, you know, in theory, rooting out white nationalists, white power folks, militia members, etc. I don't know, honestly. This is not a new thing. I will disclose that I'm a veteran. I was in the Air Force in the 90s, and those same people I worked with them. They talked about things like this, not in these terms necessarily, but they've existed for a long time. So, I mean, I think what we're seeing coming from the FBI and military leadership is a very quick reaction to the people who they've been able to identify as sort of active ringleaders, whatever you want to call them, in what happened last Wednesday. But that's just the surface. And so, I mean, I think, again, it's going to take massive involvement of ordinary people putting pressure on people who can cause change, right? I mean, legislators and educators, really, like K through 12 educators who can start to hopefully undo some of this stuff. But this is not going to be something that's solved in a generation, I don't think, because it's going to require a massive reorientation of the things that we are even even what people can imagine they can talk about, because they don't even have the language yet. I don't think that many of our fellow Americans have the vocabulary to talk about what they saw last week, or the willingness to tell the truth about what they saw last week.
Would any other panelists like to address that question?
I think that this is also what Professor Moyd has said. I think it's really important for us to understand that folks across the country at all levels were talking about going to Washington and engaging in these behaviors for weeks leading up to January the 6th. And openly talking about it on social media channels, not even trying to hide what they were going to do. And there was no attempt made by law enforcement agencies to stop this. I mean, and so you have to ask yourself, you know, some really difficult questions. We all have to ask ourselves some very difficult questions about why was there not a more concerted effort made, right? And that it's not just about the military or the ringleaders, but what about the average everyday people, right? Our colleagues, our neighbors, the person down the street. And that's the thing that's so terrifying to people like myself, right? Is that many of us have long known that there's 75 million people who turned out for this election to vote for values that are terrifying to me. And you can root out the ringleaders and you can say, you can round up a certain group of people, but we're left with the reality, as Professor Moyd said, that this is going to take years of work and, a generation or more of concerted effort to see a sea change come in this nation, because 60 million people voted for this administration 4 years ago, and more people turned out in the middle of a pandemic where hundreds of thousands of people have lost their lives, and in the midst of mass racial unrest, and voted, yes, we want more of the same. So that should tell you something, that it goes well beyond a small group of rabidly committed people, right? And so we really need to stop and deeply begin to think and process that there are, people who are just, and that's really what concerns me as an educator, right? As a woman, as a person of color, right? On all levels, that we should all be deeply concerned and should be recommitting ourselves to that, right? And I'm not saying that means we should all be paranoid, but it actually does scare me on certain levels, right? And I think we should all be scared because all across the country, in every place, there are just regular average people who are committed to, right? It's a cult of personality, right? Those of us who study history understand that it's a cult of personality, and that this is how it begins, and this is how it grows. And it has grown to the point where people are willing to, set aside rule and law of order and democracy, whatever that means, and do whatever it takes. They've always believed that they have the right to pick up weapons. And if you know about, Rosewood, and if you know about Tulsa, and if you know about Atlanta in 1911, and if you know about Wilmington, North Carolina in the 1890s, if you know the history of this nation, you know that there have always been people who are willing to set aside their ideas of democracy to do whatever it takes to instill their vision of this nation. And it's not one that coalesces with what I see as my vision of this nation at all.
I would just add to that, because I think at the heart of the problem is just what Dr. Myers was saying, right? Which is, the problem of personality. But I do believe we can change personalities. The ways that we the government invested so much funding into examining how people become radicalized Islamists, right? Why aren't we having similar funding in terms of investigating how people become radicalized white nationalists, right? I mean, alongside this, we need educational reform in which people are taught about the history and politics of scapegoating and taught to see it as a mechanism of larger forces to divert our interests from the true issues at stake, right? No one suddenly decides out of nowhere, hell, I'm going to start just hating Black people. That seems like a really good idea, right? There's sources behind this animosity, and they're not taught to understand that, you know, the easy blame, your jobs are going to Latino immigrants, and so you should hate Mexicans crossing the border, right? They're not taught to question and challenge the larger system and to think that there might be another way for our economy, just to name one problematic system, to be structured, right? And that the structure of the economy itself might be the source of their pain and their suffering, not this person next to them that happens to look a little different, but it's pretty much in the same exact situation they're in. So I think we need reform, and it can't just be at higher education. This has to start much earlier, because by the time they get to us, we spend a great deal of effort undoing the harm that's done. We don't even get quite often to the point of, well, let's think about how to do things differently.
Okay, and that's a good point for us to pivot to answer some of the audience questions about policing in particular. So there's three related ones. The first one relates, I think, to Professor Myers' presentation most directly. The question is there another term besides defund the police that you would recommend? I know that you mentioned several. There was another question as to whether requiring a college education of police help in any way address the problems that you've been discussing. And then the third related question was, what should be the modern definition of policing? Acknowledging that there is a need to preserve peace in all communities, to protect and serve, what should we expect from civil servants and under that police?
I just had to unmute myself. I realized that I was still muted. So one of the things that the police force in Camden did now back in 2013, so it's been running for a few years, is then Police Chief Scott Thompson, who has just recently retired, you know, he said very clearly that no police force is legitimate that doesn't have the consent of the people. He was very clear about that. And he also said that there needs to be a complete culture change amongst policing and police officers, and that we need to move away from a warrior mentality to a guardian mentality. And so I would charge that any police officer needs to begin to rethink why are they going into policing, and that, right, policing systems need to move away from this mentality of the warrior, right? We have police organizations all over this nation that have more military grade weaponry than than armies across the nation and in other countries, right? Who are you going into battle against? If you're here to protect and serve, why are you purchasing military grade weaponry and tanks? Right here in our own community, we spent $250,000 to purchase a Bearcat, which is essentially an armored vehicle. Okay, so I think that you know, former Police Chief Thompson's recommendations about moving from warrior to guardian, and that a police force needs the consent of the people, are a very good place to begin, right? Reconceptualizing Camden had, right, a terrible murder rate. It had a very high number of complaints in terms of use of, you know, unnecessary use of force complaints. It was considered one of the murder, you know, highest murder capitals, you know, in the country, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's something needed to be done, right? The people who lived there did not trust the police force. It was a terrible situation. And they essentially fired the entire police force and made the entire police force reapply to be hired. And not everyone was rehired. The people who were rehired had to go through intense screening processes, including psychological processes, right? Mental health screenings, bias screenings, right? Testings. They were rehired at a lower rate of pay and, all benefits, et cetera. But they rebuilt that force from the ground up. And basically, it was about community policing, right? Establishing relationships with people in, right, your neighborhood, and learning how to build trust relationships with people. And it was not about being rewarded for arrests. It was not about being rewarded for tickets. You were not going to be rewarded for arrests or tickets. It was about, like, literally, Chief Thompson said, we're going to drop you off in neighborhoods, and you're going to build relationships and establish relationships with people in your neighborhoods, right? You're not going to be rewarded for tickets or arrests. And now that we've been able to track what's happened in Camden, right? Use of force has dropped, complaints of force have dropped, murder rates have dropped. Is it perfect? No, but it's heading in the right direction. And when you talk to the people who live there, they're much happier with with policing systems there. So that's one model, right, for how we move towards police abolition, right? This discussion about defunding the police and a different phrase, my question for the person is, why does the phrase defunding the police make you so uncomfortable, right? And what is a different phrase that would make you more comfortable, right? Police abolition certainly is a phrase that makes people extremely uncomfortable. And, right, divesting funds away from policing, right, towards other services that are better equipped to handle, right, things that police are not trained to handle, is a very long way of essentially saying defund the police, right? And so it's a short way of saying that we want to actually take things out of the hands of the police that the police are not equipped to handle. Police are not trained to deal with homelessness, and homelessness isn't a crime, right? Although what's happening in Bloomington right now would lead you to think that it is, the way that Seminary Park residents are being mishandled as we speak, right? Drug addiction is not a crime, and police are not equipped to handle and should not be dealing with people who are struggling with addiction, right? And so this is the whole point, is that money should be taken out of policing and put into mental health facilities, drug rehabilitation facilities, things of that nature. If we did that, policing would shrink numerically because they would not be dealing with these situations. If we legalize marijuana and legalize the sex trade, we would shrink vice and we would shrink, right, drug units. So we would not have the numbers of police that we have currently. And therefore money would be going, we would also decarcerate. We would release people from our prisons, because we have the largest prison population in the world. And again, we would take money out of those systems and divert them into job creation and other sorts of systems. So defund the police, to me, is not a problematic term when you sit down and actually explain to people what it means. I think people get a knee-jerk reaction to it because they don't necessarily understand what it means. But if you were to say to someone police abolition, they would actually be much more, right, they would actually have a much more fearful reaction to that than defund the police.
In fairness to the questioner, their reason for asking for a different term was because they feared that the term itself is misunderstood already. So not that they personally felt uncomfortable with it, but that they thought it was charged and people might not be then open.
I think other terms are even more charged, but that's why I understand. I think other terms are even more charged. And I guess I would say what other terms would be, but I think it's who is it charged for, who is it upsetting, who is it concerning? I personally am going to say that I think that white folks always get unnerved no matter what terms Black and brown people come up with. That's my response.
That's a good segue then to our last comment slash request that the panelists address a point. And then after you each weigh in on this point shared by the questioner, we'll throw it back to Vanessa Clow for final comments. So the person writes that she'd like to appreciate, to hear the panelists' thoughts on this. It seems to me that ordinary citizens deputizing themselves and seeing themselves as auxiliary police is fundamentally tied to what Professor Eddie Glaude recently said, namely that white Americans see themselves as the only rightful owners of this country, and expressing their outrage that people of color would challenge that notion. Would you like to respond to that comment?
Yeah, Eddie Glaude.
Of course, Professor Glaude is exactly right. And I think that much of, so what I said in response to that first question about the feeling of entitlement that white folks have, enough so that they feel like they can just force their way into what is supposed to be the heart of how people in this country do democracy. Coupled with the impunity of police in this country, right? We can count probably on one hand the number of times that police have gotten anything more than perhaps being fired from their jobs. There's no punishment for the ways that they enact harm and violence on Black people's bodies, brown people's bodies, disabled people's bodies, queer people's bodies. There's no accountability, and there's certainly no punishment. And so, yeah, who am I to even try to speak to what Professor Glaude says, except I just want to say, yeah, that and so much more, that we really do have to ask white folks in this country to reckon with the fact that they are not, what are they so afraid of? What are they so afraid of that they cannot allow the legitimate results of this election to move forward in the ways that it has for most of this country's history, right? What are they so afraid of? I'll hand it over.
Actually, I think I know what they're so afraid of, but it's completely, it's ridiculous. The fear of white supremacy is very, very simple, right? They fear that Black and brown people will treat them the way they've been treating us for 5 centuries, but it's never, the response has never been, it's simply ludicrous. It's simple, their fear is simple, but it's just not. Because when you, there have been time and time again, the response from Black and brown people has not been, that's never been the response, but that is the fear.
And let's be clear, the social class that is most implicated in what happened last week, middle class and wealthy white folks. So let's be clear that this is not about some kind of stereotype about, poor white folks who just don't understand. Precisely the opposite. These folks understand, and we need to start naming that problem.
I would just add, one of the, and I posted about this on Facebook. It was maddening watching the invasion of the Capitol and hearing them yell, "This is our house," knowing that slaves built that house. So really, but I would argue though, because the other picture that sticks in my head is the invader on the Senate floor, right, all by himself, and thinking there's no way a person of color would ever get there without going through various hoops and jumps. That's white privilege. If ain't anything else, right? And I think really the mechanisms of white privilege reinforce the sense that, you know, whites own this country and no one else does, because of how often any assault on that privilege, any sense that that privilege is being etched away is reacted to with such violence, right? It's assumed as a natural state, but it's a natural state which also leads to assumptions about inherent justice, a sense of being inviolable, right? That they are always in the rights, they are beyond persecution. And so we also have to really start looking at the other mechanisms, the social mechanisms that enable and reinforce this white privilege, right? To help such folk as those in the coup understand that, no, you're the same as any other person of color as citizens, right? But before that happens, we also have to legislate to show that people of color have the same rights and are equal citizens to white Americans as well.
Well, thank you, Professor Wester, Professor Moyd, and Professor Myers. And I'd like to call Vanessa Clow to give us some final remarks. Thanks to all the people who logged in.
Great. Thank you again for joining us and participating in today's live stream. I would like to thank Professor Moyd, Myers, Wester, and Dean Halloran for their time and expertise as well. We are grateful to you all. Finally, I should acknowledge that events like this would not be possible without the support of donors who understand the value of a liberal arts education. If you would like to support the faculty, students, and programs of the College of Arts and Sciences, please consider making a contribution to the Arts and Sciences Priority Fund at the Indiana University Foundation. Until next time, please take care and stay safe.